We'll see. Maybe it was just Quebec bashing. And, all right, let's hope for that. Okay, well, my presentation is actually directly in line with Natalie's, and we actually did not coordinate, so don't see a big conspiracy here. So I'd like to review or offer a review of the first decade of the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas, so the TUCA, but that some of you may know best under its Spanish acronym CSA, Confederación Sindical de las Américas. Kim mentioned earlier today that I did my PhD thesis on labor internationalism in the Americas back in 2007. So my fieldwork was done in 2007. So that was pretty much exactly when the CSA or the TUCA came in existence. So at the moment of the merger, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, since then, I had the opportunity to spend half a year in Argentina last year and to try and update that fieldwork that was already pretty old. And so, it's obviously not exhaustive, but it gave me some kind of a historical perspective on what's been happening since then. And you're going to see that many of my comments or perspectives match Natalie's points about the ambition that the merger had in 2006, 2007, 2008 in the Americas, because it actually came later, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and the reality of what it is today. And so, very much embedded in the dynamics of the Cold War, to say it shortly. However, I want to mention that changes started happening within the orbit before the merger, and even before the end of the Cold War. And I think the perfect embodiment of those changes is this guy, Louis Anderson, who was the Panamanian General Secretary of ORIT, and who kind of embodied the contradictions of that organization. And he was a Panamanian, so he was embodying a lot of contradictions of the Americas. Because he was both pursuing the traditional mandate of the ORIT back in the 80s, but more at the end of his term in the early 2000s, he actually died while he was still Secretary General of the organization, started to shift the organization towards what's been called the social-political unionism term, the sindicalismo sociopolitico, where ORIT started to have a more autonomous position, a more progressive position, and started to challenge a little bit, at least, not completely, but a little bit, its traditional alignment with both the AFL-CIO and what we can call the corporatist trade unions of Latin America. And that provided an opening through which, after the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War as we knew it, allowed for some organizations in the Americas, for instance, the CSN in Quebec and the CUT in Brazil, to finally join the orbit, something that they had refused to do before because of the anti-communist, anti-progressive, in some ways, past of this organization. So changes started before the end of the Cold War and even the merger. Now, in that background, we also had another organization in the Americas, in Latin America in particular, CLAT, la Confederación Latinoamericana de Trabajadores, which was the regional branch for Latin America only and not the Americas, of the World Confederation of Labor, so the Christian turned multi-confessional organization. CLAT was much smaller than ORIT, although they had much more staff and a lot of money coming in particular from Belgian trade unions. But when the merger happened in 2006 in Vienna to found the ICFT, the ITUC, it took much longer in the Americas because they actually had to merge two organizations that did not want to merge. And that's when Peter Waterman's point about the fact that this merger was a European project forced onto the regions is quite relevant in the Americas. The fact of the matter is, and I studied that in my thesis, one organization that's been a key player of that merger in the Americas is not a Latin American organization. It's the Friedrich Ebert Foundation from Germany. which is not even a trade union body, it's a political foundation linked to the Social Democratic Party, but with a very strong trade union program in Latin America. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation basically ran all the meetings, all the major meetings, to end up having the merger in the Americas. And the merger led to a negotiation between CLAT and ORIT, which was, roughly speaking, won by the former ORIT. So the CSA, the TUCA, basically copied the ORIT structure, its headquarters in Sao Paulo, staff, etc. So there was a few positions led for former CLAT member, but mostly it's a transition from ORIT to TUCA. Now, when it was founded in 2008, the TUCA, under the leadership of Victor Baez, who's still the Secretary General of the organization today, so Paraguayan, former bank worker, activist under the Stroessner dictatorship, very progressive guy. My way of seeing things is that the TUCA was facing a triple challenge. First challenge, building unity. Obviously, it's a merger, and you want to make sure that sticks. Second, building a political identity. Because the kind of members that the TUCA had in 2008 were so diverse ideologically that you had to find some kind of common ground. I mean, the previous common ground was simple. ORIT was anti-communism. CLAT was Christian or some kind of confessional identity. Now, how to build a political identity out of all that? And the last challenge, I think, was mobilizing workers in order precisely to fight against this image of union diplomacy that had been carried by the ICFTU and the ORIT for so long. So I'm going to try to give a few elements about those three elements, those three dimensions for the first 10 years of TUCA. In terms of articulating a political project, I think the main document here is what's now called as the PLADA, which is the Plataforma de Desarrollo de las Américas, the platform for the Americas development. It took a long time to develop. It was first called the Plataforma Laboral, and now it's a platform of social and economic development, broadly speaking. And it's a quite comprehensive document that presents a vision of social, economic, cultural, political development for the continent. And it's really become a reference for the labor movement in Latin America, I believe. Some will say it's still very general, so that everybody feels still pretty involved. But I think it's still a pretty distinctive process for a regional organization to have engaged in such a comprehensive exercise of building a socio-political platform that will gather, in a way, the vision of the labor movement. So I think in that extent, the TUCA's goal of sort of building this kind of common political platform was a success. The second point, whatever, I'm just going to say it, I just have 4 slides. The second point was about influencing the global labor agenda, in particular within the ITUC itself. And here I come back to Natalie's point. Obviously, there was the election of João Felício at the head of the ITUC. Like Natalie said, it was a real political fight, which is, in international labor structures, very rare. Like Natalie said, usually you don't even vote. Like, everything is being decided before, it's been discussed before, it's this guy's turn, it's that guy's turn. There's no real election. And the fact that the CSA, the TUCA, as an organization, decided to regroup and support one candidate for that position is quite exceptional in the history of international labor movement organizations. So I think that, and that's worth noticing, that the TUCA was not only bringing up a candidate, but also a program that came with it to, in a way, push forward a more progressive, inclusive, social movement-oriented kind of labor internationalism. So that's one thing. Now, their second objective further down the road, because they know that the president of the ITUC doesn't do much anyway, the real power is in the Secretary General. And that's their next goal, and it's very likely that Victor Baez is going to run for Secretary General of the ITUC eventually. I say it's likely, she says it will. She's more informed than me, so believe her. Another stuff that I've studied a few years ago because of a conference that Riyad Mahan was organizing at Laurier was during the debate on the global social protection floor. I don't know if some of you guys have heard about that. Like, it's an ILO-run platform program to sort of build this kind of worldwide reference as to what should social protection be and what it should look like. The ITUC has participated in that debate. They've put forward a document. The fact of the matter is the TUCA had started that debate much earlier, in 2007, very much linked with the crisis at the time and the consequences for the workers. And they had put forward already, they had worked a lot on defining a model of social protection and proposing a certain number of principles that should drive these models. The TUCA model was in particular dealing with migrant workers, which the ITUC was not, and the question of informal workers, which the ITUC wasn't either. So there you see again how within a debate the TUCA tries to, as an organization, influence other bodies. And finally, on the question of mobilizing workers, it's always a challenge. And I think at some extent it's a little bit unfair to say about international labor movement organizations that they're not connected enough with the day-to-day realities of workers. I mean, the United Nations are not connected with the day-to-day lives of people. I mean, if they are in your life, you're in trouble. Kind of mobilization they would do. And you would have on a single day, in a lot of different countries in Latin America, marches, gatherings, occupations, etc., linked with local issues, but all united in this kind of broad-ranging theme of fight for democracy and against neoliberalism. And of course it was related to the return to in power of the right in many of those countries. So I was in Mar del Plata this year for an event led by CTA in Argentina, and it was actually pretty interesting to see even the leaflets were all carrying one side for the Americas and the other side with very Argentinian issues. Did all the workers in those marches were aware that they were participating in a continental movement? No. But at least there's an effort. There's a beginning of an effort that up until now I had been seeing only with global union federations. I know UNI does that a lot, for instance, with the bank workers, to have this kind of broad mobilization and then let the affiliates appropriate that. There's the World Day for Decent Work, that's kind of along the same lines, but that's working, depend on the year. So that's a notable effort. Finally, on the topic of unity. Unity worked pretty much in 2008 because it was not only a merger in the Americas, also worldwide. You had some new affiliates that were previously not affiliated with anyone. And that worked in Latin America as well. The foundation of TUCA led the Argentinian CTA to come in, and the Collombat, I think, an important labor center in Colombia. So up until now it was working pretty well, up until last year. Because since the beginning, the TUCA has been dominated by the more progressive organizations from the Southern Cone, namely the CUT Brazil and the CTA Argentina, to some extent the CGT Argentina, which depending on the day is progressive or not, and a couple others. But the other ones, the more conservative unions, corporatist unions, had decided to stay in and accept that situation. Now, internal conflicts has always been strong, and at the last Congress in 2016, those, I would say, right-wing unions decided to leave during the convention, to leave the TUCA. They're led by essentially Fuerza Sindical, the Venezuelan CTV, the Mexican CTM and CROC, and they've decided to launch another organization, Alternativa Democrática Sindical de las Américas, but they stay in the ITUC. So that creates a very awkward situation where they don't belong to the ITUC regional branch anymore, because the ITUC only recognized the TUCA, but they have their own club, in a way, for the Americas. So I think that's a major issue. On the left as well, we've seen the emergence of another organization called el Encuentro Sindical Nuestra América, which is more or less related to the World Federation of Trade Unions. It doesn't represent such a danger for the TUCA as such, because there's a lot of organizations that are both involved in the TUCA and in ESNA, but it's also an attempt to revitalize the WFTU in the continent, in particular through the Brazilian CTB, the CGTB Peru, and the CTC in Cuba. And finally, when the merger happened in 2008, the TUCA had this goal of having sub-regional coordinations for each sub-regions in Latin America. There was one in the Southern Cone that had been existing since 1986, so it wasn't new, the Coordinadora de Centrales Sindicales del Cono Sur, and they wanted to found one in the Andean region and one in Central America. Those attempts have not really worked, and now we even find sort of tensions between the Coordinadora and the TUCA over who's representing the labor movement, for instance, to UNASUR, to new international organizations in the region, and also the fact that in the Coordinadora, the right-wing unions are still there. So there's a number of tensions that are happening. So I just basically wanted to present you with those findings. I know again that they're not exhaustive. I've mostly gathered them through interviews with union representatives in Argentina, in Brazil, and Uruguay last year. But I think it's worth looking with more attention to these kind of organizations and to make those kind of balances to see where they're heading. I think the issue of building working class unity, in a way, is still at the very center of those contradictions. And like Mike mentioned it this morning, I mean, doing labor unionism at the international level is not so different as doing it at the national level. Finding ways to put together organizations that are very different